There was a time, not so distant in the scope of human history, when the idea of retirement did not exist. Not because people were denied rest or because they were exploited beyond measure, though hardship was common enough, but because the concept itself had no place in the way life was organized. Work was not something you did for a certain number of years before stopping. It was something you did for as long as your body allowed, for as long as you were needed, for as long as the rhythms of survival required it. In a village, somewhere in what we now call Germany, in the late 1600s, an old man wakes before the sun. His hands are stiff, his back aches in ways it did not when he was younger, but he rises anyway. There are animals to tend, repairs to make, wood to split. His son does most of the heavy work now, has done so for several years, but the old man still moves through the morning tasks, slower than before, but present, contributing what he can. He has been doing this work since he was a boy. He will do it until he can no longer stand. There is no other plan, no moment when the work will simply end and something else will begin. His wife, older than him by a year or two, though neither of them could say exactly, tends the fire, prepares the morning meal, checks on the chickens. Her hands shake slightly as she works, and her daughter has taken over most of the heavier tasks, the carrying of water, the washing of clothes, but she still does what she can. She has been doing this work since she was old enough to be useful. She will do it until she cannot. This is understood, unspoken, woven into the fabric of how life proceeds. This was ordinary. This was how most people lived, for most of history, in most parts of the world. The idea that there would come a time when you stopped working, when you were supported without contributing, when your days were spent in leisure or rest simply because you had reached a certain age, this idea was foreign, unimaginable, unnecessary. Work was not separate from life. It was life, the rhythm of the days, the turning of the seasons, the needs of the household and the community. All of this required labor, constant and ongoing, and everyone who could contribute did so. Age brought changes, a shifting of roles, a passing of the heaviest burdens to younger hands, but it did not bring an end to work. In the fields of rural England, in the early 1700s, a farmer in his 60s continues to walk the boundaries of his land, to check on the crops, to make decisions about planting and harvest. His sons do the plowing now, the heavy lifting, the work that requires strength and endurance. But he is still the one who knows the land, who remembers what worked and what failed, who carries the accumulated knowledge of decades. He cannot retire from this knowledge. There is no replacement for it, except time, the slow transfer of experience to the next generation, and even then, his presence matters. He has never thought of himself as working toward a finish line. There is no year he is waiting for, no age at which he expects to stop. He will continue until his body fails, and when it does, his role will diminish naturally, gradually, until he is doing less and less. And then one day, perhaps, nothing at all. But that endpoint is not planned. It is simply what happens when a person reaches the end of their capacity. This pattern repeated itself across continents, across cultures, across centuries. In rural China, an elderly woman continues to tend the garden, to prepare food, to watch over grandchildren. Her back is bent from decades of work. Her hands are gnarled, but she still contributes what she can. Her family would not dream of telling her to stop, and she would not understand if they did. Work is not a burden to be escaped, not in the way it might seem from a modern perspective. It is purpose, identity, connection to the household and the community. In a village in West Africa, an old man sits in the shade, weaving baskets. He has been weaving baskets since he was a child. His fingers are slower now. His eye is not as sharp, but the skill remains, and the baskets are still needed. He will weave until he can no longer hold the materials, until his hands finally refuse the work. No one has told him when that should be. It will happen when it happens. The absence of retirement was not a failure of these societies. It was a reflection of how life was structured, how resources were distributed, how families and communities functioned. In a world without pensions, without social security systems, without the accumulation of wealth that allows a person to live without working, there was no mechanism for retirement. But more than that, there was no cultural expectation of it. The idea that a person should spend their final years in leisure was not part of how people understood the arc of a life. Leisure existed, of course. There were festivals, rest days, times when work paused for celebration or mourning or simply because the season demanded it. But these were breaks within the larger rhythm of labor, not permanent states. A person might rest on a holy day, might sit and talk with neighbors in the evening after the work was done, but the next morning, the work would resume, and it would continue until the next break. The elderly were not idle. They could not afford to be. Their labor might be less strenuous, more suited to their declining strength, but it was still labor. An old woman might shell peas while the younger women cooked. An old man might mend tools while the younger men worked the fields. These contributions were valued, expected, woven into the functioning of the household. In medieval Europe, the concept of the life cycle was understood through a series of stages, often depicted in art and literature. There was childhood, youth, adulthood, and old age. But old age was not retirement. It was simply the final stage of a working life, a time when the body weakened and the work adjusted accordingly, but did not stop. A blacksmith, well into his 60s, continues to work at the forge. His apprentice, now a journeyman, does the heavy hammering, the work that requires the most strength. But the old blacksmith still shapes the more delicate pieces, still makes decisions about heat and timing, still teaches. His hands are scarred, his hearing is damaged from years of noise, but he is still the blacksmith. He will be until he can no longer stand at the forge. When that day comes, and it will come, he will not suddenly enter a new phase called retirement. He will simply do less, perhaps sitting near the forge, offering advice, perhaps moving to lighter tasks around the house, perhaps spending more time resting. The transition will be gradual, unmarked by any ceremony or formal change of status. He will fade from full participation, slowly, until one day he is no longer working at all. And then, not long after that, he will die. This was the pattern. Work until you could not, then fade, then die. There was no extended period of leisure, no golden years of rest and travel. The end of work and the end of life were closely connected, separated by months or maybe a year or two, not by decades. The reasons for this were partly economic. In agrarian societies, where most people lived, wealth was scarce. A household might produce just enough to feed itself, with little surplus. There was no savings account to draw from, no pension fund, no government support for the elderly. If you did not work, or if your family did not support you, you faced real hunger, real hardship. But the reasons were also cultural and social. Work was not just about survival, it was about identity, about one's place in the family and the community. To stop working, to become dependent, was to lose a part of yourself. It was a diminishment, tolerated when unavoidable, but not sought out, not celebrated. In Japan, in the centuries before industrialization, the elderly continued to work in whatever capacity they could. A farmer in his 70s might no longer be able to manage the rice paddies, but he could tend the kitchen garden or make repairs to tools or watch over the children while the younger adults worked. His contributions might be smaller, less physically demanding, but they were still contributions, and they still mattered. The household was an economic unit, and every member had a role. The young provided strength and energy. The middle-aged provided experience and consistency. The old provided wisdom and lighter labor. This division of roles was flexible, adjusting to individual circumstances, but the expectation of contribution was constant. Everyone who could work did work. This expectation was reinforced by necessity. A household that could not mobilize all available labor was at a disadvantage, more vulnerable to crop failures, to bad weather, to illness. The margin between survival and disaster was thin, and every bit of effort mattered. The elderly were not a burden to be supported in idleness. They were members of the household, expected to do their part for as long as they were able. In the cities, the pattern was similar, though the nature of the work was different. A tailor in his 60s continued to sew, though he might take on simpler projects, might work fewer hours, might rely more on his apprentices. A baker continued to bake, adjusting his role as his strength declined. A merchant continued to manage his shop, even if he could no longer lift the heavy goods or travel to markets. The craft guilds of medieval and early modern Europe had rules about who could work and how, but these rules did not include retirement. A master craftsman might take on fewer commissions as he aged, might delegate more to his journeymen, but he remained a master until he died. There was no formal end to his career, no point at which he was expected to stop. In some cases, guilds had provisions for supporting members who could no longer work due to injury or illness, but these were forms of charity, not retirement. They were for those who had become incapable, not for those who had simply reached a certain age. The assumption was that a healthy person, even an old one, would continue to work. This assumption was not always fair, and it did not always account for the reality that aging brings decline, that not everyone can work until they die. But in a world without the resources to support large-scale retirement, fairness was a luxury. The system was built on necessity, and necessity left little room for accommodation. An old woman, living in a city in the Netherlands in the early 1600s, continues to spin wool in her small room. Her fingers are stiff, her eyes weak, but she can still produce thread, and the thread can be sold, bringing in a few coins to help pay for food and rent. She has been spinning since she was a child. She will spin until she can no longer hold the spindle. There is no other plan. If she reaches a point where she truly cannot work, she will depend on her children, if she has them, or on charity if she does not. The city has some provisions for the poor, but they are meager, and they come with conditions. She would rather work, even when it is painful, even when it brings in very little, because the alternative is dependence, and dependence is a kind of death. This fear of dependence was widespread, deeply felt. To be unable to care for yourself, to have to rely on others, was a source of shame, a mark of failure. People worked as long as they could, not just because they needed the money, but because not working meant admitting defeat, accepting a diminished status. In rural communities, the elderly were often integrated into the household in ways that spread the burden of support. An old person might not produce as much as a younger one, but they still contributed something, and that something justified their place at the table. A grandmother watching children was doing work, even if it was not as visible or as strenuous as plowing a field. A grandfather mending nets was contributing, even if he could no longer go out to sea. These contributions were real, and they were valued. But they were also a way of managing the economic reality that not everyone could produce as much as they consumed. By finding tasks that the elderly could still perform, families made the burden of supporting them more bearable. It was a practical arrangement, shaped by necessity, but it was also, in many cases, an expression of care and respect. In some cultures, the elderly were honored, their wisdom and experience seen as valuable resources. In others, they were tolerated, their continued presence accepted as an obligation. But in nearly all cases, The expectation was that they would contribute as long as they could. The line between being old and being retired did not exist because retirement did not exist. The shift towards retirement, towards the idea that work should end at a certain age, began slowly, driven by changes in how societies were organized and how wealth was accumulated. In the late 1800s, as industrialization spread, some governments began to experiment with pension systems, providing support for the elderly who could no longer work. Germany, under Otto von Bismarck, introduced one of the first state pension systems in the 1880s. It was designed to provide for workers who reached the age of 70, later reduced to 65. But these early pensions were modest, and many workers did not live long enough to collect them. The system was more symbolic than practical, a way of addressing social unrest, of demonstrating state care, but it did not fundamentally change how most people experienced old age. For the majority of the population, especially those in rural areas, life continued much as it had before. They worked until they could not, and then they depended on family or community support. The pension system, where it existed, was a safety net for a small number of people, not a universal expectation. In the United States, retirement as a widespread practice did not emerge until the mid-1900s, after the establishment of Social Security in 1935. But even then, the transition was gradual. Many people, especially farmers and the self-employed, continued to work well into old age because that was what they had always done, because they did not have enough saved to stop, because the idea of not working felt strange and uncomfortable. A farmer in Iowa in the 1940s continues to manage his farm into his 70s. Social Security provides a small monthly check, but it is not enough to live on. Not really. Not if he wants to maintain any kind of independence. He keeps working, doing what he can, his sons taking over more and more of the operation, but he is still there, still involved, still contributing. He does not think of this as a failure to retire. He thinks of it as life, as the natural progression of things. His father worked until he died. His grandfather worked until he died. The idea that he would stop working simply because he reached a certain age feels foreign, disconnected from his sense of who he is and what life is supposed to be. This generational difference was common in the early decades of retirement systems. The older generation, raised in a world without retirement, continued to work out of habit, out of necessity, out of a deep-seated belief that work was what gave life meaning and structure. The younger generation, growing up with the possibility of retirement, began to see it differently, as a reward, a goal, something to look forward to. But the transition was uneven, shaped by class, by occupation, by geography. Urban workers with pensions and savings were more likely to retire. Rural workers and the self-employed were more likely to continue working. The wealthy could afford to stop working earlier. The poor often could not afford to stop at all. In the United Kingdom, the introduction of the Old Age Pensions Act in 1908 provided a small income for those over 70. But again, many people did not live that long, and those who did often found the pension insufficient. They continued to work, in whatever capacity they could, supplementing the pension with wages, or they relied on family, or they ended up in the workhouse, a grim institution for the poor and the elderly who had no other options. The workhouse was a place of last resort, a place where the elderly who could no longer support themselves were sent to live in exchange for whatever labor they could still perform. It was not retirement. It was a different form of work, often harsh, often humiliating, but it was still work, still the expectation that those who could do something would do it. A woman in her 80s, living in a workhouse in London in the early 1900s, spends her days picking apart old ropes, pulling the fibers loose so they can be reused. Her hands are raw. Her back aches constantly, but she does the work because that is the condition of her staying there. She has no family, no savings, no other options. She works until she can no longer, and then she waits to die. This was the reality for many people, even as retirement systems were beginning to emerge. The safety nets were thin, the expectations of continued labor were strong, and the line between work and retirement remained blurry and contested. In traditional societies, where the elderly continued to work until they could not, there were often informal systems of support that cushioned the final years. A household might take in an aging parent, providing food and shelter in exchange for whatever work they could still do. A community might look after an old widow, bringing her food, checking on her, expecting little in return but acknowledging an obligation. These systems were not always generous, not always sufficient, but they existed, and they provided a buffer against the harshest outcomes. The elderly were not simply cast aside when they could no longer work. They were integrated, as best as resources allowed, into the fabric of family and community life. In some cultures, this integration was formalized through customs and traditions. In Confucian societies, the principle of filial piety required children to care for their aging parents, to support them materially and emotionally, to honor their presence even when their productivity declined. This was not charity. It was duty, a moral obligation that shaped how families were structured and how resources were distributed. An elderly man in rural China in the 1800s lives with his eldest son's family. He no longer works the fields, his strength gone, but he is still present, still part of the household. He tells stories, watches over the grandchildren, offers advice when asked. His presence is a burden, in some ways, an extra mouth to feed, but it is also a connection to the past, a source of wisdom, a fulfillment of the son's duty. This arrangement was not perfect. It could create tension, resentment, conflict over resources, but it was the system that existed, and it provided a framework for managing the challenge of aging in a world without retirement. In Native American societies, before the widespread disruption of European colonization, the elderly often held important roles as keepers of tradition, tellers of stories, advisors to the community. They were not expected to hunt or gather as they once did, but they were still valued, their contributions shifting from physical labor to cultural and spiritual work. An old woman in a Lakota community, in the years before reservations, no longer follows the buffalo hunts, but she is the one who knows the songs, who teaches the children, who holds the history of the people. Her work is different from the work of the younger women, but it is still work, still necessary, still a part of what sustains the community. These roles were not retirement in the modern sense. They were adaptations, ways of integrating the elderly into the life of the community even as their physical capacities declined. The expectation was still contribution, still presence, still participation in the collective life. The idea that retirement is a universal human right, that everyone should be able to stop working at a certain age and live in comfort, is a very recent development, emerging only in the second half of the 20th century in a few wealthy countries. For most of human history, in most places, this idea would have seemed absurd, impossible, disconnected from the reality of how life was lived. People worked because they had to, because there was no alternative, because the structures that would allow widespread retirement did not exist. But they also worked because it was what they knew, what gave their lives shape and meaning, what connected them to their families and communities. An old fisherman on the coast of Norway in the early 1800s continues to go out in the boat, though his son does most of the rowing, most of the hauling of nets. The old man's knowledge of the sea, of where the fish run, of how to read the weather, is still valuable, still needed. He cannot retire from this knowledge. It is not something that can be easily transferred or replaced. He knows he is slowing down, that the work is harder than it used to be, but he does not think of stopping. He will fish until he can no longer get into the boat, and when that day comes, he will sit on the shore and mend nets, or carve new floats, or do whatever work he can still manage. The progression is natural, unforced, shaped by the limits of his body, rather than by any external rule or expectation. This organic transition from full work to partial work to no work at all was how most people experienced the end of their working lives for most of history. There was no formal retirement, no ceremony, no sudden change. There was only a gradual fading, a slow reduction in capacity, until finally the work stopped because the person could no longer do it. In some cases, this transition was relatively smooth, cushioned by family support and community care. In other cases, it was harsh, marked by poverty and suffering. But in nearly all cases, it was understood that work continued as long as the person was able. The idea of stopping work while still healthy, while still capable of contributing, was foreign, wasteful, unthinkable. The stigma against idleness was strong, reinforced by religious teachings, by social norms, by the practical reality that resources were limited and everyone needed to contribute. In Puritan New England, idleness was seen as a sin, a failure of moral character. In Catholic Europe, work was seen as a form of penance, a way of earning grace. In Confucian societies, work was a duty, an expression of one's role in the social order. These beliefs shaped how people thought about old age and work. To stop working was to fail in one's duty, to succumb to weakness, to become a burden. People internalized these beliefs, pushing themselves to continue working even when it was painful, even when their bodies were breaking down, because the alternative was unacceptable. A woman in colonial America, in her late 60s, continues to manage her household, to cook and clean and tend the garden, even though every task takes longer, even though she has to rest frequently, even though her children could take over. She does not want to stop. Stopping would mean admitting she is no longer useful, no longer needed, and that admission feels like a kind of death. Her children, watching her struggle, feel a mix of concern and respect. They want her to rest, but they also understand that rest is not what she wants, that work is what keeps her alive, what gives her a reason to get up each morning. So they let her continue, stepping in when necessary, but not forcing her to stop until she is ready. This tension between the desire to protect the elderly and the need to respect their autonomy, to allow them to continue contributing as long as they want, was common in many cultures. It reflected a recognition that work was not just about economic production, but also about identity, dignity, purpose. In Buddhist societies, the elderly might transition into religious roles, spending more time in meditation and prayer, less time in physical labor. This was not retirement in the modern sense, but it was a shift, a recognition that the focus of life changes as one ages, that the work of the soul becomes more important than the work of the body. An old man in a village in Thailand, in the years before rapid modernization, spends his mornings at the temple, making offerings, listening to the monks, sitting in quiet contemplation. In the afternoons, he still tends his small plot of land, still helps with the harvest when it comes, but his energy is less focused on these tasks than it used to be. He is preparing for the next life, letting go of the concerns of this one, but he is still present, still part of the community, still doing what he can. This gradual withdrawal, this shift in focus from worldly work to spiritual preparation, was another way of managing the transition from full capacity to decline. It provided a framework for understanding the changes that come with age, a way of giving meaning to the reduction in physical activity. But even in these contexts, the expectation was still that the elderly would contribute in whatever form was appropriate to their stage of life. The idea of complete idleness, of doing nothing, was still seen as problematic, a sign of giving up, of no longer being fully alive. The invention of retirement as a widespread social practice required several conditions that did not exist for most of human history. It required wealth, surplus resources that could support people who were not producing. It required longevity, people living long enough after their productive years that retirement became a significant phase of life. It required new ideas about the life cycle, about what old age should be, about the rights and dignities owed to the elderly. These conditions began to emerge in the late 1800s and early 1900s, first in industrialized countries, driven by economic growth, by labor movements demanding better conditions, by the development of pension systems and social insurance. But the transition was slow, contested, uneven. For many people, especially those in rural areas, especially those in the developing world, the old patterns persisted well into the 20th century. They worked until they could not, and then they depended on family or community, or they suffered. Retirement remained a distant concept, something that happened to other people, not to them. A farmer in rural India in the 1960s continues to work his land into his 70s. His sons have taken over most of the heavy labor, but he is still the one who makes the decisions, who knows when to plant and when to harvest, who negotiates with the buyers. He has never heard of retirement, or if he has, it is something that happens in the cities, to people with government jobs and pensions, not to people like him. He will work until he can no longer stand, and then he will sit in the shade, watching, advising, still present, still part of the operation. His sons will care for him, as is expected, as he cared for his own father, and the cycle will continue, generation after generation, unchanged by the distant developments in other parts of the world. This persistence of traditional patterns, even as retirement became more common elsewhere, highlights the diversity of human experience, the way that different societies adapted to the challenges of aging in different ways. There was no single universal trajectory, no inevitable progression from work to retirement. There were many paths, shaped by culture, by economics, by the particular histories of different regions and peoples. In post-World War II America, retirement became more normalized, more expected. The expansion of Social Security, the growth of employer pensions, the increase in life expectancy, all of these factors created conditions where retirement was not just possible but desirable, a reward for a lifetime of work. But even here, the transition was not universal. Many people continued to work past the official retirement age, either because they needed the money, or because they wanted to keep working, or because they did not know what else to do with themselves. The idea of a life without work, after decades of working, felt empty to some, aimless, disconnected from any sense of purpose. An assembly line worker in Detroit, reaching 65 in the 1970s, retires with a pension and Social Security. For the first few months, he enjoys the freedom, the lack of schedules, the ability to sleep in, to spend time with his grandchildren. But gradually, a restlessness sets in. He misses the routine, the sense of accomplishment, the camaraderie of the factory floor. He takes a part-time job at a hardware store, not because he needs the money, but because he needs something to do, some reason to get up in the morning. This experience was common, especially among those who had worked their entire lives, who had known nothing but work, who had built their identities around their jobs. Retirement, for them, was not liberation. It was a loss, a removal of structure and purpose, and many struggled to adapt. The challenge of finding meaning in retirement, of creating a life that is fulfilling without the anchor of work, is something that emerged as retirement became more common. For most of history, this was not a problem anyone faced, because retirement did not exist. But as it became a reality, as people began to live for decades after stopping work, the question of what to do with that time became pressing. Some people filled their retirements with hobbies, with travel, with volunteer work, with caring for grandchildren. Others struggled, feeling lost, purposeless, waiting for death. The experience varied widely, shaped by individual circumstances, by personality, by the resources available. But underlying these varied experiences was a fundamental shift in how life was understood. The idea that there should be a period at the end of life dedicated to rest and leisure rather than to continued work was a new idea, and not everyone embraced it easily. In countries with strong welfare states, like those in Scandinavia, retirement became more secure, more generous, allowing people to stop working without fear of poverty. This created a different kind of retirement, one that was more about choice and lifestyle than about necessity and survival. An office worker in Sweden, retiring in the 1980s, receives a pension that allows for a comfortable life. She travels, she takes classes, she spends time with friends and family. Retirement, for her, is a positive phase, a time of freedom and exploration unimaginable to her grandparents, who worked until they died. This more comfortable version of retirement, the one that has become the ideal in many wealthy countries, is a historical anomaly, a product of specific economic and political conditions. It is not the natural endpoint of human development, not the way things have always been or always will be. It is a particular arrangement made possible by particular circumstances, and it remains out of reach for most people in most parts of the world. Even today, in many countries, the majority of people work until they can no longer, relying on family support in their final years, living without the safety net of pensions or social security. The world of lifelong work, of never retiring, is not just a historical curiosity. It is a present reality for millions of people. An elderly woman in rural Bangladesh in the 2020s continues to work in the rice paddies, her back bent from decades of labor. She has no pension, no savings, no expectation that she will ever stop working. She will work until her body gives out, and then she will depend on her children, hoping they can support her, knowing they have their own struggles, their own burdens. This is not a moral failure, not a sign of backwardness, but a reflection of the economic reality that retirement requires resources, and resources are not evenly distributed. The ability to retire is a privilege historically and geographically specific, not a universal human experience. For those of us who live in societies where retirement is normal, expected, it is easy to forget how recent this development is. How many people throughout history lived without it? How many people today still live without it? It is easy to assume that retirement is natural, that it has always been the goal, that work is something to be endured until we can finally stop. But this assumption is false. For most of human history, work was not separate from life in this way. It was integrated, continuous, ending only when the person could no longer continue. The idea of a sharp divide between working years and retirement years is modern, a product of industrialization, of changes in life expectancy, of new ways of organizing society. Understanding this history, recognizing how different the past was, can change how we think about work and retirement today. It can help us see that our current arrangements are not inevitable, that they are choices made by societies, and that different choices are possible. It can also help us appreciate the privilege of retirement, the freedom that comes from being able to stop working while still healthy, while still having years of life ahead. This freedom was not available to our ancestors, and it is not available to many people today. It is something to be valued, not taken for granted. As the night deepens, as the mind begins to drift towards sleep, these reflections on work and retirement, on the long history of human labor, start to blur and soften. The specific details fade, and what remains is a sense of the continuity of human experience, the ways that people have always had to find meaning and purpose, the ways that the challenges of aging have always been present, always been managed in different ways by different societies. The old man in the German village, waking before dawn, the farmer in England checking his fields, the woman in China tending her garden, the fisherman in Norway going out in the boat, all of them are connected by the common experience of work, of doing what needs to be done for as long as they can. Their lives were hard in many ways, shaped by necessity and limitation, but they were also full, rich with the texture of daily labor, of contributing to something larger than themselves. And for them, the absence of retirement was not a tragedy. It was simply how life was. They did not long for something they had never known, did not feel deprived of a right that had not yet been invented. They lived according to the rhythms of their time, and those rhythms included work, continuous and ongoing, until the very end. In the soft space between waking and sleeping, it is possible to imagine what that might have felt like, to live in a world where work was not something you did for a certain number of years before stopping, but something woven into the fabric of every day, for as long as you were able. It is possible to imagine the weight of that expectation, but also the clarity of it, the simplicity of knowing that your role was to contribute, to do what you could, to be part of the collective effort of survival and flourishing. This was not an easy life, not a comfortable life by modern standards, but it was a life that made sense within its own context, that had its own logic and structure, that provided meaning even in the midst of hardship. And as sleep finally comes, as consciousness fades into the quiet dark, these images and reflections dissolve, leaving only a vague sense of connection to the past, to the long line of human labor that stretches back through the centuries, to all the people who worked their entire lives without ever retiring, who found purpose and identity in their labor, who lived and died in rhythms very different from our own. The transition to a world where retirement is normal, where people expect to stop working at a certain age, is still unfolding, still incomplete. There are still many places where the old patterns persist, where work continues until the body fails, where the idea of retirement remains distant and unattainable. And even in places where retirement is established, questions remain about its sustainability, about whether future generations will have the same opportunities, about what happens when populations age and the ratio of workers to retirees shifts. These are complex problems, without easy solutions, and they remind us that the arrangements we have now are not permanent, not guaranteed to last. But for now, in this moment, in the quiet of the night, these future uncertainties can be set aside. What matters is the recognition that human experience is varied, that people have lived in many different ways, that the structures we take for granted are recent inventions shaped by specific historical circumstances. The people who worked their entire lives without ever retiring were not fundamentally different from us. They faced the same basic challenges of existence, the same need to find meaning and purpose, the same inevitable process of aging and decline. They simply navigated these challenges within a different framework, with different expectations and different resources. And they managed. They lived full lives, raised families, built communities, created cultures, all while working until they could no longer. Their lives were not defined by the absence of retirement, just as our lives are not defined by its presence. Life is larger than any single arrangement, any single system, any single way of organizing time and labor. In the deep night, when the mind is quiet and open, this larger perspective can bring a kind of peace, a sense that the specific details of how we organize our lives are less important than the underlying patterns of human connection, of work and rest, of growth and decline, of living and dying. The farmer still checks his fields, even in old age, because that is what he knows, what gives his life shape. The woman still tends the fire, still prepares the food, because that is her role, her contribution, her way of being part of the household. The craftsman still shapes his materials, the teacher still passes on knowledge, the storyteller still tells stories, all of them working in whatever capacity they can, for as long as they can, because that is how life proceeds, how it has always proceeded, for most of human history. In some households, the transition of labor from old to young was marked by subtle shifts in responsibility, small ceremonies of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. A father might hand his son the best hammer, the one he had used for 30 years, and say simply, "This is yours now." The son would take it, understanding what was being given, not just a tool, but a responsibility, a place in the line of craftsmen that stretched back generations. The father would continue to work, but with a different hammer, a lesser one, acknowledging without words that the center of the work had shifted, that he was moving to the edges while his son moved to the center. This happened gradually, over months and years, so gradually that no one could point to a specific moment when the change was complete. The pace of work in old age was different, shaped by what the body could still manage. An elderly woman in a village in Poland in the 1700s would rise later than she once did, her joints needing more time to loosen, more time to accept the demands of the day. She would move through her tasks more slowly, stopping more often, but she would complete them, or at least as many as she could. Her daughters and daughters-in-law would pick up what she could not finish seamlessly, without comment, understanding that this was how the household worked, how the labor was distributed. She was still part of the system, still necessary, even if her contribution had diminished. To remove her entirely from the work would have been to remove her from life itself, to declare her useless, and that was not done lightly, not unless her body truly gave her no choice. In the evening, when the work of the day was done, the elderly would often gather with others, sharing stories, passing on knowledge, maintaining the oral traditions that held communities together. An old man in a village in Ireland, sitting by the fire, would tell stories of his youth, of the great storm that destroyed half the village, of the year the potato crop failed, of the time he traveled to the next county for a wedding. These stories were not just entertainment. They were history, memory, the collective knowledge of the community preserved in the minds of those who had lived through it. This was work too, a different kind of work, but essential nonetheless. The work of maintaining continuity, of connecting past to present, of ensuring that the younger generation understood where they came from. The death of someone who had worked their entire life was often quick, coming not long after they finally stopped. An old blacksmith, too weak to stand at the forge any longer, might sit for a few weeks, watching others work, and then one morning simply not wake up. His death would be mourned, but it would also be accepted as natural, as the right order of things. He had worked as long as he could, and when he could no longer work, the end came swiftly. There was a kind of mercy in this, in the close connection between the end of work and the end of life. A mercy that is perhaps lost in a world where people live for decades after stopping work, where the question of what to do with all those years becomes pressing and often painful. The villages and communities that operated without retirement were not idyllic, not free from hardship and suffering. There were people who worked themselves to death, who pushed their bodies beyond what they could bear because they had no choice. There were people who suffered in their final years, dependent and helpless, waiting for death with a mixture of resignation and relief. The absence of retirement did not mean the absence of struggle, but it did mean a different relationship with work, a different understanding of what it meant to grow old, a different set of expectations about how life should be lived from beginning to end. In the collective memory of these communities, there were stories of those who had worked the longest, who had remained useful the deepest into old age. These stories were told with a mixture of admiration and caution, recognizing both the strength required and the cost paid. An old woman who had spun wool until she was 90, who had finally died with the spindle still in her hand, became a kind of legend, a measure against which others compared themselves. But there was also the unspoken understanding that not everyone could be like her, that most people would fail sooner, that the body had its limits, and reaching them was not a moral failing but simply the way of things. The quiet acceptance of this pattern, of work continuing until it couldn't, was perhaps the most striking difference between that world and ours. There was no sense of injustice in it, no feeling that people were being denied something they deserved. The concept of deserving rest simply because you had reached a certain age did not exist. What existed was the understanding that you contributed as long as you could, and when you couldn't anymore, your community would support you if it was able, and if it wasn't, well, that was the hardness of life. The reality that not everything could be fixed or softened. And in the deep darkness of night, in the space where all these reflections finally settle into something wordless and still, that acceptance becomes almost comprehensible, almost possible to feel. A different way of being in the world that is both foreign and strangely familiar, both distant and somehow close, connected to us through the long chain of human experience that never breaks, that continues still, in every person who works, who ages, who faces the inevitable decline, with whatever grace and strength they can muster, carrying forward the patterns laid down by countless generations who came before. The quiet acceptance of this pattern, of work, continuing until it couldn't, was perhaps the most striking difference between that world and ours. There was no sense of injustice in it, no feeling that people were being denied something they deserved. The concept of deserving rest simply because you had reached a certain age did not exist. What existed was the understanding that you contributed as long as you could, and when you couldn't anymore, your community would support you if it was able, and if it wasn't, well, that was the hardness of life, the reality that not everything could be fixed or softened. And in the deep darkness of night, in the space where all these reflections finally settle into something wordless and still, that acceptance becomes almost comprehensible, almost possible to feel. A different way of being in the world that is both foreign and strangely familiar, both distant and somehow close, connected to us through the long chain of human experience that never breaks, that continues still in every person who works, who ages, who faces the inevitable decline with whatever grace and strength they can muster, carrying forward the patterns laid down by countless generations who came before. The rhythm of a life spent working from childhood to death had its own particular texture, its own way of marking time that had nothing to do with calendars or milestones. A carpenter in a small town in Austria, somewhere in the early 1800s, would measure his life not in years but in the projects he completed, the houses he helped build, the furniture he crafted. In his mind, time was organized around these pieces of work, each one a marker, a memory attached to a specific set of hands and tools and wood. When he grew old, when his hands began to shake and his eyes grew dim, he did not think about how many years he had worked. He thought about the last table he made, wondering if it would truly be the last, hoping perhaps for one more, just one more piece to complete before his hands refused entirely. This way of measuring life through work rather than through time gave a different quality to aging. There was no countdown, no sense of approaching a finish line. There was only the work itself, continuing day after day, and the slow accumulation of things made, tasks completed, problems solved. An old seamstress in a city in Spain might have sewn thousands of garments over her lifetime, each one a small piece of the larger whole, and as she aged, as her output decreased, she did not think of herself as failing. She thought of herself as still sewing, still part of the craft, still connected to the work that had defined her since she was a girl learning from her mother. The quantity mattered less than the continuation. The fact that she was still doing it, still present, still part of the flow. In rural communities, where the work was tied to the land and the seasons, this sense of continuity was even stronger. A farmer knew that the work would outlast him, that the fields would need plowing and planting and harvesting long after he was gone. His contribution was just one small part of an endless cycle, and when he could no longer contribute fully, the cycle would continue without pause. There was something both humbling and comforting in this, in knowing that the work was larger than any individual, that his particular efforts would be absorbed into the larger pattern and continue. An old farmer, sitting at the edge of a field he could no longer work, watching his grandchildren bring in the harvest, was seeing the future and the past simultaneously, understanding his place in the long line of those who had worked this land. The knowledge passed from old to young was not just practical, not just about how to do specific tasks, but also about endurance, about how to keep going when the body hurt, when exhaustion set in, when the work seemed endless. A young man, working alongside his aging father, learned not just how to repair a wagon wheel or sharpen a scythe, but also how to pace himself, how to find the rhythm that would allow him to work for decades without breaking down entirely. He learned by watching his father's hands, still moving through the motions even when they trembled, still finding the right angle even when the strength was diminished. This apprenticeship in aging, in continuing to work despite the body's protests, was as important as any technical skill. In households where multiple generations lived together, the presence of working elders created a particular atmosphere, a sense of layered time where past and future coexisted in the present moment. A child, watching her great-grandmother shell peas with slow, deliberate movements, was seeing both the distant past, all the years that woman had lived and worked, and also her own future, the possibility that she too might one day be old and still working, still part of the household's daily rhythm. These observations shaped how children understood life, gave them a framework for thinking about aging that was fundamentally different from the one that would emerge later when retirement created a sharp division between the working years and the years after. The absence of retirement also meant that wisdom and experience remained accessible within communities in ways that later became harder to maintain. An old merchant, still going to his shop every day, even though his sons managed most of the business, was available for consultation, for the difficult decisions, for the problems that required decades of experience to solve. His presence was not ceremonial, it was functional. People came to him because he knew things that could not be learned quickly, that required a lifetime of attention and practice. When retirement became common, when older people withdrew from their fields of expertise, communities lost this easy access to accumulated knowledge, and the transition of wisdom became more deliberate, more forced, less organic. There was also a social dimension to continued work that retirement disrupted. The workplace, whether it was a field or a shop or a market, was not just a place of labor but also a place of connection, of daily interaction with others. An old woman who continued to sell vegetables at the market was not just earning a small income. She was maintaining her place in the social fabric of the town, seeing familiar faces, hearing news, participating in the ongoing conversation of the community. When people retired, when they withdrew from these daily interactions, they often experienced a profound loneliness, a sense of having been cut off from the flow of life. This was a new problem, one that previous generations had not faced, because they had worked until they could no longer leave the house, and by then, death was usually close. The physical spaces where people lived and worked also reflected the assumption of lifelong labor. Workshops were often attached to homes. Fields were within walking distance. The distance between work and rest was measured in steps rather than miles. An old shoemaker could move from his bed to his workbench with minimal effort, could work for an hour and then rest, then work again, fitting labor into the rhythms of his aging body without having to travel or maintain the pretense of full capacity. This flexibility, This ability to work in small increments, to rest when needed, made it easier to continue working even as strength declined. The later separation of home and workplace, the requirement to commute to a job and work fixed hours, made this kind of gradual scaling back much harder, contributing to the need for a formal end to work.